If I ask you to think of a picture of God, an image of God, if I ask you to imagine what God looks like, what comes to mind for you? It may seem like a strange question. I'm sure many of you will be thinking to yourselves that you know that this is kind of a trick question, right? You know the right answer. The right answer is to say, oh, well, Scott, God doesn't look like anything. God is transcendent and beyond everything. And yet, my guess is that maybe something came to mind for you. Some image came to mind. You know, I think a lot of people, when they try to think of what God looks like, perhaps in spite of themselves, they may think of something like the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which has this famous image of God reaching a finger out to touch Adam's finger, showing that moment in the first chapter of Genesis when God creates humankind. And God is depicted as an old white guy with a beard. Now, of course, we know, I hope we know, God is definitely not an old white guy with a beard living in the clouds. But again, I think most of us do have images in our mind that come to mind. And if it's not that picture, maybe it's another picture. And even if no pictures come to mind, we all have ideas, concepts of who God is, right? We have these images, these ideas of who we think God is, or who we think God is supposed to be, or who we think we just want God to be. Now, in our Hebrew Bible passage for this morning, we continue to follow Jacob. We've been following Jacob now for a number of weeks. And in today's reading, we return to Jacob about 20 years after he's left home. 20 years after Jacob had that strange experience of meeting God in the wilderness, where he saw that staircase coming down from heaven. We're 20 years on, Jacob is returning home, and he's going to meet God again. Again, alone in the wilderness, Jacob will meet God for this second time. You know, my guess is that Jacob had some images and some ideas in his mind about who God was supposed to be, right? The last time Jacob met God, it went really well for Jacob. He got blessing and protection. God offered a blessing and promised to protect Jacob and didn't ask for anything in return. Jacob got a blessing and protection with no strings attached, even though Jacob had been up to some things that weren't so good. Part of the reason he was leaving home was he had deceived his brother and his father, and he had been acting a bit greedy. And yet he gets that blessing and protection. No questions asked. Well, when Jacob meets God for the second time, he doesn't meet that God I think that he was expecting. That easy, convenient God who just gives him what he wants and asks for nothing back. He has a very different experience, a strange and even upsetting experience. Like I said, I think we all have images and ideas in our minds of who we think God is. And probably the ideas and images we have of God are images and ideas that work well for us, right? We grow up kind of wanting God to be what we need God to be. A God who shares my opinions, a God who gives me what I want without asking, just like Jacob had received. A God who looks and sounds comfortable to me, whatever that might be. And in that sense, the images and ideas we have of God can actually be problematic, right? They can become idols, that we worship these ideas and images of God rather than God's self. They're not idols of wood or stone or precious metal, but these mental idols can still get in the way of us actually knowing who God really is. Spiritual maturity, taking the journey of faith, is all about letting go of those idols, letting go of those images and ideas that are comfortable and easy so that we can see God for who God really is. Again, I think Jacob sought one God in this second encounter, the story we hear today. He sought one God, but he found another. He wanted protection, but what he gets instead is an injury, right? He walks away from this encounter limping. He wanted a blessing, and he ends up getting a blessing, but notice that this man or angel, or maybe it's actually God's self, right? that this mysterious visitor only offers a blessing after he's given Jacob a new name, a name Jacob didn't ask for, and a name that's perhaps a bit ominous. Israel means he who struggles with God. Not exactly a straightforward blessing. Notice as well that Jacob seeks a name for this mysterious visitor. He wants a name. He wants another image, another idea that he can fit God into. And he gets nothing in response. This is not the God that Jacob had been wanting or expecting. This really is a different God than maybe the one he encountered before. Jacob has to be willing to let go of who he thought God was in order to actually see who God really is. But what's most surprising about all this is, look, this is a traumatic, difficult, confusing experience for Jacob. And yet, when he leaves this place, notice what he names it. He doesn't name it difficulty or confusion or dangerous bad place. He calls it Peniel or Penuel, which means the face of God. In this traumatic, difficult, confusing experience, Jacob recognizes that by giving up who he thought God was, he's actually come to see God more clearly, the face of God. So what ideas of God, what images of God do we need to give up so that we might see God more clearly, so that we might see God face to face? Each of us is going to have to answer this question for ourselves, of course. But I can speak from my experience. I think in my sort of mid to late 20s and into my 30s, I really had this sort of one God in my mind. I preferred a sort of philosophical, academic God. I like to think of God in intellectual terms, and I kind of like to think of God as sort of intellectual, abstract, a God who is at arm's length, a God that I could understand and analyze and make sense of. And if I'm honest, a God that I could sort of be in control of a little bit, right? Because if God is intellectual and abstract, I can sort of keep God where I want God. I can sort of have this comfortable relationship, one that's easy for me. But in the last year or two, I realized that the God that I was imagining for myself was another mental idol. And with the help of a spiritual director, I've been seeking a deeper and closer and realer relationship with God. Changing my prayer life, I've come to discover God more present in my life. This God is not abstract or distant or just intellectual. The God I've discovered is unpredictable and close. And this God makes demands on me, calls me, challenges me, and changes me. Just like the God Jacob discovered, right? Changed Jacob, gave him a new name, and challenged him to a deeper and better life. When we let go of our old ideas of who God is, we can discover God more clearly. And I'm sure the understanding of God I have now is still not really who God is, but I hope I'm getting closer. One of these days, the way I'm understanding God now will itself become an idol that I'll have to put away in order to meet God all over again. That's the process of spiritual maturity. That's the journey of faith that we're on. And it is traumatic and difficult and confusing because the God that I find myself discovering is strange. The God I'm discovering is a God who does answer prayers. I've experienced that. Frequently takes days or weeks. But the other thing is that the answers I get are almost never the answer that I actually wanted. Just like Jacob seeks God's name and instead gets a new name for himself. The God who is alive and present is an unpredictable, very unpredictable God. This God will change and challenge us. And I have to say that, a deeper and further experience of this change and challenge, this unpredictability, this confusion of God's presence is this sermon itself. I have been struggling all week with this sermon. And that surprised me because the passage we're looking at today, this passage from Genesis of Jacob wrestling with the angel, is a passage that I love and I know well and I've studied before. And so I thought, when this passage came up, I was excited. Yes, I know what I'm going to preach on. But I've rewritten this sermon 4 and 5 times. I've really struggled to try to understand what it is I'm supposed to hear in this passage this week. And even now, in my 5th rewrite, I can tell that I'm missing something. There's some idea, there's some image of who God is or who I want God to be that's still getting in the way of me really understanding what's going on here, of me really seeing God's face. So I have more work to do, more struggling to do, more idols to put aside, to turn and find that unpredictable God who's always present. Maybe you have the same challenge in front of you. And to be clear, when we say that the images and ideas we have of God aren't who God is and we should be ready to let go of them, that doesn't mean that they're bad. It doesn't mean that it was wrong for me to think of God in an intellectual or abstract way earlier in my life. It's just to say that those ideas and images are useful to an extent, and when they stop helping us to find God, we let go of them, and we find new tools to let us continue the journey. As I struggled with my sermon this week, I was reminded actually of a parable or a metaphor from Buddhism. Buddhists will frequently talk about their religious practice in this way. They'll say, look, life is like a river, a wide and fast river. It's changing, it's suffering, it's difficult, it's confusing. And the goal is to cross this river. And so Buddhism, their religious practice, is like a boat. And the boat helps them to cross the river of suffering and confusion and danger. And it's good. The boat is good. And we Christians might use a similar metaphor, right? Jesus is frequently getting into boats. But here's the thing. Once you cross the river and you've gotten to the other side, you're on land again. There's still more journey to do. There's still progress to make. The journey of faith continues. But if you need to walk inland over land, you wouldn't stay in the boat. You wouldn't drag the boat with you. It would slow you down. So you get out of the boat and you continue your journey, needing new tools to continue forward. Likewise, the ideas and images we have of God aren't bad. If they help us to make progress on our journey, that's good, but we have to recognize when to let go of those images and ideas. Because if we hold on to them, they become idols. We worship those mental idols instead of constantly seeking God's presence anew and afresh. That's the challenge before us. And I think that's what Jacob learns and what Jacob can teach us today. I think the truth of the matter is that the incarnation, which is sort of an old idea in Christianity, but the incarnation, this idea that God is somehow uniquely present in Jesus, is in truth a very new idea. I think most of us, and I'll certainly speak for myself, don't quite understand what we're supposed to learn from the incarnation. It's still a radical, strange, confusing idea. And I think most of us would prefer our abstractions or our comfortable images of God, instead of this radical claim that God is present with us and calls us to new life. So my goal for us, especially today as we renew the reception of the Lord's Supper, as we renew the celebration of the Eucharist, is that we will let go of old ideas and images of God, that we will let go of these mental images and turn to that mysterious God who is always present. Giving up our mental idols, we might actually meet God face to face.